Welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses. I am here with Rabbi Menachem Linzer, principal and head of school of Hillel Torah North Suburban Day School in Chicago, Skokie, Illinois. Rabbi Linzer and I go way back, I think actually all the way back to my Shana Aleph at Gush, where he was my Night Seder Chabura leader, and I've spent a lot of years learning from him. And thank you very much for making the time to be here with us today, Rabbi Linzer.
It's great to be here, Barry, and excited for our conversation.
Amazing. So what I shared with Rabbi Linzer before, and what you've heard me talk about a bunch if you've been listening, is the question of how we really maximize the effectiveness of our day school boards. My belief is that boards have a tremendous potential. They can elevate what we do well beyond what we could do if we were only doing it as professionals. But like in the levels of leadership, working effectively with your board may be on like that black diamond expert level, which takes a while to learn and master. And so what I'd love to hear from you, Rabbi Linzer, is over your time at Hillel Torah, you've been there successfully for many years. I think your record speaks for itself. I know just from our dealings that you have wonderful relationships with your board members. And so let's try and pull back the curtain a little bit and hear about, like, you got there from a different job. I'm guessing this was your first time working with a board. How did it start, and how did you get to where you are today?
Great. It's a great topic, and I agree. It is something that many people aren't necessarily always prepared for. I know for me, I was coming from a role as being an assistant principal in another school. And in that role, I had zero to do with the board. The head principal, the head of school is the one who dealt with the board. The assistant principal, I had never stepped into a boardroom. And then all of a sudden took this job as a principal, which is essentially head of school. And my role was to deal with the board. And I had no idea. I had no idea what is a board? What does a board do? What am I supposed to do with the board? It was extremely helpful having a coach at the time, and that was part of it's a separate podcast, but the importance of coaching and the value of coaching, especially for heads of school and really, I think, all school leaders. But having a leadership coach at the time, that's one of the things we talked about. I said, well, what is this? What am I supposed to do? And eventually I also spoke with some other colleagues who are more senior than I, in terms of hearing from them what their experiences were. And that, I think, helped me start to understand a little bit how to approach things. And then obviously I've learned a lot from trial and error along the way.
Yes. Yeah. We all have the bumps and bruises to testify to the errors. I'm going to call out that note about coaches. If you are ahead and you don't have a coach, get one. I'm not saying hire me. I'm not even saying hire Rabbi Linzer, who I know does. One or two lucky people get to get coached by him as his little side hobby of helping the field. But get yourself a good coach, because otherwise you're alone. And fundamentally, it changed my life as a head. Rabbi Linzer, I know you're saying it changed yours. And if you're out there listening and you don't have a coach, go get one. All right, commercial aside. Back here, so you got advice about boards. You got advice about boards from a coach, boards from your colleagues in other schools. What was the best piece of advice that anyone gave you? Or some of the best pieces of advice? You don't have to narrow it down to just one.
It's a good question. I don't remember exactly what the advice was. It was a while ago. But I think it was important for me at the time to understand what is the role, and like just even governance, for example. Like when you're not in that role yet, you're just, let's say you're an assistant principal, whatever it is, you don't think about governance. You don't even use that word. You think about your teachers, you think about, the curriculum, you don't think about governance. And I think that was one of the big pieces of the transition for me, is understanding there's a concept called school governance.
Right. What is that? Can you explain that? Because I was like, governance? Oh, yeah, that probably means the local elections, right? They happen in November. So
right.
How would you explain the concept of school governance to somebody sitting there saying, what is that?
Right. So a school is a unique organization. It's not a company that's owned by like a privately owned company, for example, where it's very clear the founder, the CEO, is in charge of everything. The school is really like a joint operation, I would say, with a lot of parts to it. And how do all those parts work together? And that is the governance. The governance is kind of who's in charge of what. What is the governance structure? I mean, we could talk about kind of what the ideal governance structure is. I think aside from what the ideal is, I think the important part is having a structure and having clarity around that structure is even more important. And different schools may have slightly different structures, and that's fine. I'm not a big believer in best practice, like there has to be one way to do things, because each community, each school, each situation may be somewhat unique. But having clarity around whose role is what and the fact that all those parts need to work together, I think those are the two critical pieces.
Right. So absolutely. And I think that's an important point, right? Schools are not owned. And in my mind, they're too sacred to be owned. They're entrusted. And they're entrusted to our boards who serve as their guardians. They're the guardians of the school on behalf of the community. And so everything sort of flows from there. If you're the guardian, you're not necessarily going to be running Shachrit. You're not going to be welcoming kids off of the bus. I certainly hope not. But you have a different level and a different view. And then the question goes to, okay, well, so what's your role as a head? I've been quoting Jane Tabenfeld Cohen a lot on this. She didn't say it for the first time on this podcast, but she did say it on this podcast. So I'm claiming that recording where she said that being head is one of the most unique jobs because the board is your supervisor. They're your boss in a sense. But you also have to be the one to be teaching them because they're not professionals. They're lay leaders giving of their own time, and they need that kind of guidance and development over the years. So I'm curious how that fits with what your take. Would you put it that way? Would you put it differently?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point. And I think that is unique. And I would just add to the complexity of it, to what Jane said, is that not only do you need to be teaching them, but they're your boss, they're the head's boss, but they're not in the school day to day. So, and they're not necessarily experts, nor should they be expected to be experts in how school runs and how school does things. And they're not there with you. So, I mean, this is like kind of gets to a little bit more of an evaluation question, topic, which may not be our topic right now, but like, how could they be your boss and evaluate and know what you're doing? And if they don't know how a school really runs and they're not with you, and so what is their window and how should they do that evaluation? So that just adds to the complexity of this relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the broad relationship part, and then there's these board meetings. How many board meetings does your school typically have over a year?
We used to have more, and we used to have some executive board meetings too. Now we've tried to really streamline a lot. How many do we have? Maybe 6 or 7 over the course of the year.
So take us through, like, let's say I'm a new head. I come in and, I'm working in a school similar to yours. We've got 6 or 7 meetings. We've really, streamlined. We have a good sense of our governance structure. We have good people on the board. So how do I prepare for a meeting and how do I get to an effective meeting?
It's a good question. I think the board meetings aren't really the key, to be honest. The board meetings are kind of it's almost like an iceberg. It's like that's the only part, like maybe that's very visible, but the board work is really that giant iceberg that's beneath the water. So the meeting is like one piece of it, but it's not about the meeting really. It's really about engaging with the board, for the head to engage with the board president, with the officers, whether it's the treasurer, and ensuring that there's good working relationships. And there's a lot of side meetings. The reason why there's only 6 or 7 full board meetings is because, most of the work doesn't happen at the board meeting. The board meeting is kind of a way for the whole board to get together, to hear what's going on, to build community amongst the board, to learn together and other things, obviously big decisions. But most of the board work really happens in either one-on-one with the counterpart in the school and the vice president of whatever that area of the board is, or in smaller committee meetings. That's where I would say more of the time is spent and more of the kind of decisions are made. And then when it comes to the board, it's a little bit more of a formality to the full board. So I mean, it doesn't really answer your question yet, but it sort of kind of sharpens it.
Okay, so it starts to frame it, right? Because you're saying, and this is something that is surprising to a lot of people, the work does not happen at the board meeting.
For the most part.
Yeah, right? I think that's absolutely true and often completely missed. If you try to do the work at the board meeting, you end up more with a board fight than with a board meeting.
Yeah.
Because you don't bring a bunch of busy leaders into a room for an hour and say, okay, now we're going to make a decision on our financial aid policy. That doesn't work.
Right.
So take us through a little bit of like how that actual work happens. How do you, just you alone, principal, head of school, who on the board do you work with and how, and then we'll reconnect it to the meeting from there.
So the main counterpart for the head of school is the board president. Okay, that's the main relationship, I would say. The person that the head or the principal spends the most time with and has the most intensive relationship with. It's someone who the head needs to keep updated about everything going on in the school. And by the way, everything I'm saying now, the best way I found is to, at the beginning of a tenure of a new board president or a new principal, is to have a meeting with their counterpart and what's the word, and like kind of talk out a little bit and
set the stage, align expectations
for what that relationship is going to look like. What do you need from me? What I need from you? How are we going to communicate and all that? So, really being very explicit and upfront about that, in the best way possible. And then
let me pause you there just because I want to make sure that doesn't get lost, right?
Yeah.
So we'll go back to coaches. My coach did this with me when I had a new board chair. I do it with all of my heads when they have a new board chair or when a new head comes into an existing board chair. We set aside generally like 2 to 3 hours of getting to know you. Everything from communication styles, hopes, dreams, expectations, how I'm going to tell you if I'm upset, how you can reach me in an emergency, like all of these pieces. The first time I did it, I was terrified because it happened to me in this case. The president was like somewhere in the Fortune 500 or 300 CEO category. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to ask him, how we should reach him. And does he prefer vacationing on the beach or to a hike to like get into his leadership stuff? And he was like engaged and enthralled and it just set the relationship out on a right foot. And people avoid it because it's like awkward. I don't want to, we're just going to do the. But if you take that time, either one-on-one, if you're an experienced, head like yourself, or if you're newer, maybe with a coach facilitating, set the frame for how you're going to work together and how your relationship's going to go.
Yeah. I think that's really a hugely important step. And realize that it is such an important relationship, and any relationship, in order for it to be strong, needs to be the two parties need to invest in it. It's not just going to happen. It's not just showing up. It's not just like a formality. It's a real relationship. So whoever the people are, that's going to look different, but making sure you're treating it as such. And for the head, this is not like a sideshow of their job. A lot of heads maybe think, oh, my job is the school, my job is the curriculum, my job is whatever, other things. And your job is all those community events, maybe all those things. But working together hand in hand with the board is a huge part of the head's job and should not be shortchanged. Like you have to carve out time for those meetings with the board president. You have to carve out times for all the committee meetings, whatever it is. Like that time is really important.
And that's really hard, right? I mean, I'm not sure when you do it. Those meetings for me, based on people's work schedules, were either 7 a.m. or 8 p.m. And it meant there are certain other things I couldn't do, but I also knew if I took my finger off the pulse for a minute, I was going to have a whole lot to dig out of because I would have broken the partnership.
Yeah. And another commercial, you gave a commercial about coaching. I want to give another commercial to give permission for heads of school to also realize that it's okay to change your work schedule accordingly, meaning because so many of the responsibilities of the head of school, which is different than almost anyone else in the building, okay, is a lot of outside of school time. Most teachers, everyone else, they're on, 9 to 5, 8 to 4, whatever the schedule of the school is. Head of school like their main showtime is usually actually before school or after school, and of course during school as well. But it's okay to carve out other times to catch your breath and to, to kind of unwind or whatever it is, because you can't always do it in the morning early, and you can't always do it late at night because you're in other meetings. So maybe it's coming in late one day, maybe it's leaving early one day, maybe it's taking a day off, whatever it is. The head of school has to take care of themselves, because if they don't take care of themselves, then they can't take care of the school.
Right. So let me just put you on the spot. What do you do?
So I do come in. Well, first of all, I will be not. I won't feel guilty about not doing another commitment. Like I'll feel more comfortable saying no to something else, because I know what my priorities are, and I can't do every single thing. So I focus on what are the things that I really need to do, and if something I really can't, like I need that time for my family, for myself, I'll say, I can't make it. And what I'll say is also I have a conflict. I can't make it. I have a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have another meeting at that time. My conflict is my life and my personal life and my family. And that's just as good, if not a better conflict than having another school event at that time.
That's amazing.
So
I love that.
My secret is not out of the bag here on this podcast.
No, you can keep yours, but I'll let mine out because I already, moved on. When I was head of school in Cleveland, we had the good fortune of the school being within less than a 10-minute drive of 4 or 5 national or state parks. And I'm a runner. So I would always have my running gear, winter, summer, didn't matter, in the back of the car. And I could cut out of school early, which I think meant 5:30. And swing out to a park for a run. I would not run through the community at 5:30. That's a good idea. But going on a trail was amazing. I only did it because my coach, pushed me to. And absolutely. Okay. So now we've gone in a few different directions here. One
thing I'll tell you is before I took this job, I actually had a meeting with Richard Joel back in New York, and as president of YU at the time, and I just getting some advice on leadership. And one of the best pieces of advice he gave me, he says, I like to work from home on Fridays, and he actually, this piece of advice, I do remember exactly what he said. He says, if you don't protect your time, no one else is going to protect it for you. And that is so true. So true. So wise. No one is thinking about everyone else wants a piece of your time, but no one is thinking about protecting your time. So in his case, it was working from home one day, I'll take a late morning and go for a long bike ride or something like that, again, because the nights are usually filled with events and meetings. You can't be 24/7, something's got to give. So permission for head of school to take whatever time they need for themselves to stay sane.
Right. And you're doing that, but you're not cutting out your weekly meeting with your board chair.
That's right. No, that has to be part of that schedule, right? You could cut out other non-essential things, which you think you have to do everything, but really, a separate conversation about delegating, it's probably other things which your assistant principals or whoever should be doing, and leave it to them. You don't have to necessarily be at every one of those things because they're in charge of it, and give them the space to lead in those ways. And the head needs to focus on the areas where you need to lead.
Okay. Amazing. So, coming back here, you've got a board meeting coming up in 3 weeks, but the real work's going to happen with you and your president. What work are you doing with your president on an ongoing basis? And then how does that interface smoothly with what happens in a board meeting?
Okay, so the goal here is to talk about board meetings, just clarifying.
The goal here is to talk about, how do you get from Rabbi Linzer and his board chair meet every week? We're working on thinking about things, partnering around things, and now we've got a board meeting. So now what do we do?
So this goes back to like setting the relationship with the board chair. Is every board chair I've had, we've done things differently. I always say to them, they're here to support me, and I always say to them, I'm here to support you, because they're usually new. They have a 2-year term, until they know what's going on. It's time for the next person. I'm the more consistent factor. Right. So I'm here to help them and make for them, it's a volunteer job. So I'll say, I want to make your job as easy as possible. Whatever I can do, I personally, or the school, whether it's a secretary, whatever we could do to support you. So part of that question is, when it comes to preparing for board meetings, who wants to take a first stab at drafting the agenda? Is that something you want to do? or is that something you'd like me to do? And we've had it differently. I would say more often than not, the board chair is very happy to have me draft the first draft of the agenda. And me or my assistant, kind of own that document and all of the paperwork and tee it up. I did have one board chair in particular who was very comfortable owning it all himself, and that was great. Again, it's all part of talking it out. But most of the time I will come in and kind of with a draft agenda of typical things we have and say, here's an agenda maybe from the year before, whatever, just some basic stuff, and talking about what's been going on in the school and the board and what do we need to be focusing on in this meeting. I should say, actually, take a step back. One of the things we've done over the past number of years, which is really nice, is we look at the whole year of meetings and we try to plan out kind of what's the main think about a meal, what's the main course at each board meeting. So you have all general reports typically, but that's kind of boring if that's all you're doing at the board meeting. So we want to give some conversation topic, something to chew on, some main course. And so what we've done, for example, is we may bring in someone to give a little board workshop about something about how, board, what's the word I'm looking for? How boards work, or board what's the role? A board learning kind of thing about the role of the board. We may have different leaders from within the school. Maybe we want to focus on admissions. So we'll have the admissions director come and give kind of a presentation with some data over the past number of years. And then it leads to a very lively conversation. And people noticing this trend, noticing that. Have we ever thought of this? And it becomes a little bit, the board is learning about that area of the school, and the board is able to give input and some direction of what they're finding or they think may be important to both me, but also to the admissions director. We've done the similar thing with our communications director. How are we thinking about marketing and communications? We've done a similar thing on the academic side as well. So even though this is not topic maybe of the podcast, but the roles and responsibilities of the board versus the professional staff is so critical, is the most critical part of that governance, going back to the beginning, understanding that governance structure. So the role of the board typically, hopefully, is not to oversee and micromanage the educational decisions of the school day to day, but the board also needs to have a window into what those are, and from time to time do a deep dive and have a presentation from one of the academic directors or principals.
And your people, your communications director, enrollment principals, they're not worried that if you do this, the board's going to tell them, I don't know, what to teach in fourth grade math tomorrow?
Again, it goes back, it goes back to the iceberg, right? So the majority, there has to be a really good understanding before this kind of a meeting as to what is the role of the board and what's the role of the general studies principal or general studies director. You can't just walk into a meeting and let's talk about it, and then everyone's thinking, oh, wait, they want me to weigh in on, the homework policy in fourth grade. So, it goes back to laying that foundation, right? And it doesn't happen at the beginning of the meeting. It happens at the beginning of the year, and it happens throughout, and it's reinforced throughout. So.
Okay. So I'm just going to highlight something that you said. You kind of slipped it in there at the beginning, but I think it's shocking. I've been trying to develop some various little resources to put on my website just for people to be able to access the things that I wish I would have had. And one of them, which I have not posted yet because I'm a little bit behind, maybe it'll be posted by the time this podcast goes out, is an annual board calendar. Right? What you said is, we don't go and say, what should we talk about in February? We do what every good teacher does with their course in advance of the year, which is, here's where I want to get to by June. Here's how I'm going to get there. And I plan out the whole year. That's point number one. If that is what people take from this, that's sufficient, right? You plan your whole year. You don't figure out day by day or meeting by meeting. Then the other piece you noted, if I can distill the components, you've got your annual plan, you've got a few updates, we're all pretty clear on those, and then you've got a combination of board learning, which you offer them both about their own role and about the school, and what I would call generative discussion, where you're basically saying, hey, you guys aren't in the trenches, which means you may have ideas that we don't, and there's collective wisdom in this room. And so the board meetings are not just sit around and, everybody talks and nobody listens. It's we've established the foundation for you to know you're going to learn about the school, and you're going to be engaged in a deep, thoughtful conversation, not about what should be taught in tomorrow's math class, but about where our school's going on all these different fronts.
Yeah, exactly. For example, like finance is obviously one of the main topics. We didn't even talk about it, but there's a certain time of the year where we set the budget. So how do we bring that in? How do we educate the board? How do we make sure the board is constantly being educated about the school finances, not just a brief report, but to really understand the budget and the development. What are we doing? How are we doing it? What's your role? That's a recurring, very big topic. And at a certain point in the year, that becomes like the main course in like two meetings or so. Right. Setting tuition, what data needs to be brought to the meeting, and that the finance committee, for example, is meeting a lot, outside of the context of the full board meeting, but then a certain aspect of it comes to the full board meeting, and then that gets discussed. So not every little detail gets discussed at the big board meeting, but the board does need to weigh in on the significant decisions of the school and needs to be educated enough to be able to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, I think everything you're saying is so simple, and we would all do it in a classroom, but there's a tremendous fear factor for new heads coming into a board. And sometimes you just kind of forget, you don't just put a budget out on the table with your board and say, hey, should we raise tuition? And they're all like, well, they have no way to answer that. But if you have, and I was really, really fortunate to have an amazing treasurer in some of my first years as a head who would sit down and say, okay, guys, here are the 4 major factors that impact our budget. We've got these revenue streams. We've got these expense streams. Here's how they interrelate. We're not talking about numbers right now. We're talking about values. So Let's take a step back and think about where we want the school to be. And then we'll translate it into the numbers that have to make this budget work. It made the budget conversation a mission conversation, which was great. People weren't just thinking, oh, how much is this going to cost me? They were thinking, what's best for this school, which has been entrusted to me for the generations of the community.
Right. And that's really the best way to have the budget conversation at the board meeting, because not everyone around the board table has that treasurer like mindset, but they all, should have that mission mindset. And that's why they're around the table. And that's really, once the board sets the priorities, okay, then now the finance person in the school needs to figure out how to kind of translate that into the dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The same way again. Sorry, go ahead. You're about to say something else.
I think the tricky part, and you said it sounds simple, and a lot of things are simple, but I think the tricky part, it's different than a classroom in a way that in the classroom, like the teacher's sort of in charge and the kids are like, teacher's role is to teach and their role is to learn. And yeah, okay, there's interplay. Mi talmidai yoser mikulam. Okay, fine. But here you really have who's in charge of what and who's leading. I think that's the complicated part about them. It's not setting a calendar, that you're right. That's the simple part. But where the board part gets really, really tricky, and I think it takes time to learn, is the head. Okay, yeah, I'm in charge of a lot of things, but they're in charge of me, but I also need to educate them. And ultimately they really do make the final decisions on things, but I need to present them a certain way. There's a very tricky interplay between the head and the board of kind of who's in charge. And ultimately it's kind of yes, the board technically is, kind of hires the head and, for sure the board, has that final say. But on a day-to-day basis, it's like this co-leading dynamic with each one being in charge of something else and having to always be working hand in hand. And again, if you do it well, it's great, but that's where things could get tricky.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just because of where we are in time, we're going to continue this. Either I'll come back and record, or we'll just do it offline so that I can learn. But to me, that goes back to what you were saying before, right? These are complex relationships, which means our below the line tendency is to ignore the conversation, and our above the line imperative is to have those conversations in advance explicitly so that we can be on the same page.
In advance, and then it probably needs to be revisited a bunch of times too, because usually it's not sufficient and you don't think of everything, and then in the moment,
Yes. Yeah, and you will fall. You will fall, right? You're juggling. I said this to a head I coached the other day. Like, you're juggling a lot of balls, but the nice thing about balls is they bounce. So you're going to drop them, and that's fine, but you keep juggling and you keep moving with it. And with that, we're going to let all of our listeners keep moving with the balls that they're juggling today. Thank you, Rabbi Linzer, for joining us. This has been amazing for me. I love that our relationship continues and allows me to continue learning from you and learning with you. And if you have any thoughts at home, any comments for me, for Rabbi Linzer, please feel free to reach out to us. Like always, you can find us, Leadership Lenses on Substack, Barry Kislowitz on LinkedIn, or KislowitzConsulting.com.
Thank you, Barry.